Bad news for Joe Biden and some others as well, as a federal judge rejected the president's revised Title IX proposals that would have included gender identity, pregnancy or related conditions, and sexual orientation as protected categories.
The revision would have potentially mandated schools and their staff to call students by their preferred pronouns. It also would have allowed transgender students to use single-sex restrooms that they best identified with.
One of the judge's rejections was on free speech grounds. He wrote, "Put simply, the First Amendment does not permit the government to chill speech or compel affirmance of a belief with which the speaker disagrees in this manner. The entire point of Title IX is to prevent discrimination based on sex," Judge Reeves continued. "Throwing gender identity into the mix eviscerates the statute and renders it largely meaningless."
The Congressional Equality Caucus spoke out on the matter, writing, "POTUS and the Education Department made it crystal clear. Title IX protects LGBTQI+ students, survivors, and pregnant and parenting students. Now a Kentucky judge has struck the entire rule down. All students deserve to attend school free from discrimination and harassment."
Author and former NCAA swimmer Riley Gaines celebrated the ruling, writing, "Huge win for girls and women everywhere. This morning, a federal court ruled in favor of reality. Biden's Title IX rewrite has been vacated nationwide. Common sense is slowly returning. Thank you, Tennessee AG." So I view this ruling, similarly to Riley Gaines, as a huge victory for women and girls. There were a lot of perhaps intended, but certainly unintended consequences of including gender identity as a protected class under Title IX. This applies to things like bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, pretty much any single-sex space that you could think of. And when you're looking at elementary, middle, even high school, you're looking at young girls and women who are in a very vulnerable state, who I think shouldn't have to be forced to change or share private spaces with individuals who are members of the opposite sex, regardless of what gender they say that they identify as. That doesn't change the biological sex reality of what's happening there. And I think we have an obligation to make sure that women and girls' private spaces are protected and kept solely for them.
You know, Amber, I think that this issue and transgender-related policy issues in general are just very challenging. You know, I think that people on both sides of the aisle have the best of intentions, honestly. I may sound very Pollyanna in describing it that way, but I think, you know, Democrats are hoping to ensure that an entire group of individuals is not discriminated against. People on the GOP side of the aisle want to make sure that people are not vulnerable as a result of changes in policy. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, you're talking about real human beings who are going through all sorts of challenges, who are figuring out who they are as human beings. And then you add into it, there's some scientific analysis about what happens when, for example, individuals start to take hormones and make that transition, which then muddies the water even further. I think it's just a very difficult set of discussions and policy interventions.
Yeah, well, it's very magnanimous of you. I appreciate that very much. I guess I don't find it as complicated, and I know that sometimes people's hearts are in the right place trying to protect these kids who have gender dysphoria, and I think that's totally reasonable and admirable, but unfortunately I think as a society we've gotten this one really, really wrong. When you look at where this trend, as you could call it, it started in the Netherlands through a Danish study that was very poorly designed, that claimed that these young people's mental health gets better when they undergo things like puberty blockers and hormone therapy. And now, 10, 15 years on from the Dutch model becoming the standard for the rest of the world and it quickly being adopted in the United States of America, they've actually abandoned this practice because they found that when they tried to repeat the study, they couldn't do it. There were design problems with the original study, and there's been additional reviews and studies like the Cass report in the UK's National Health Service that found the opposite, that actually 80 to 85% of kids who have gender dysphoria end up desisting by the time they reach adulthood, and that there are so many side effects, negative side effects to puberty blockers and hormone therapies that even if there was a slight increase in mental health benefits related to them, that it wouldn't be justified because of how heavily negative the side effects are. But even so, you don't actually see an increase in mental health outcomes for young people. And so even if if the Democrats and the left say that they're trying to protect these kids, they don't want them to be discriminated against, the fact that they refuse to accept this additional science that has come out that shows that their preferred method of treating gender dysphoria in young people doesn't work is extremely problematic.
I mean, I think the challenge, I hear everything you're saying, Amber. I think the challenge is that, I go back to my point that these are real people and they are going through the challenges. They are figuring out who they are. They are experiencing discrimination in real time. And at the end of the day, as a former policymaker myself, I just feel like you can't just throw up your hands and say, because we don't have the answer, then the status quo is the way to move forward. Not that I'm saying that that's what you're saying. I have worked with a number of transgender individuals. My own teen daughter right now introduced me to someone in her class who is transgender. And the fact is, transgender individuals exist in our communities and they need support. And so we have to continue to grapple with these issues and figure out the appropriate path forward.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that there needs to be endless compassion and empathy for people who are struggling with how they feel about themselves and their bodies. But I think the approach of trying to medicalize it is the wrong approach. We should be making sure that these kids have access to therapy, to loving families who are being supportive of them. Because we've seen that when in some of these studies they actually did not get rid of therapy as a co-founding variable, but in some they did, and those are the ones where they found that the pharmaceuticals that they were giving the kids did not increase the mental health outcomes. So I think the answer needs to be encouraging young people to accept who they are. And I don't mean that in the sense of accepting who you think you are, but accepting the biological reality. And there's a lot of trauma that these gender dysphoric kids often experience that leads to them getting this diagnosis in the first place. And you find that the gender dysphoria doesn't pop up on its own, but it's usually as the result of something else. The majority of young people who identify as transgender also are diagnosed with autism. And in young women in particular, my great friend Mary Margaret Olahan wrote a book about this, talking to detransitioners. A lot of young women have been the victims of sexual trauma. And so the way that they basically protect themselves is by identifying as a member of the opposite sex, identifying as a man, because they are under perhaps the false impression that men don't get assaulted, or at least not as often as women, or that men won't want to assault them if they don't have the body that looks female. From the male perspective, sometimes it's a problem with not feeling masculine enough and thinking it's easier to just identify as a female. So there are a lot of really complex, complicated reasons why people become gender dysphoric. Again, I reject the notion that the answer to any of those is to encourage people to go along with what is effectively a delusion.
Well, and with all due respect, Amber, I think even the term gender dysphoria is problematic. The transgender individuals that I know would tell you they are who they are. I mean, this conversation ultimately isn't terribly different than conversations we've experienced in recent years and past decades around whether you believe someone is born gay or not, right? The transgender person would tell you they've always been who they are. And I think it's, candidly dangerous to try to tie whether somebody's transgender or not into significant mental health issues, into whether or not they're autistic. I mean, I think the numbers themselves really kind of speak to the fact that there are many transgender individuals here in the United States, all around the world, who are not autistic, who do not have mental health issues, apart from the fact that they have been living a life as a person that they don't feel that they actually are.
I guess the problem with that, though, is when you do look at the research on transgender individuals and their mental health pre- and post-transition, you see that in some cases their mental health gets worse, according to some studies. In others, it stays about the same. And regardless of that, they do experience much more severe mental health issues, just on average, compared to general population, people who you would probably call cisgender. So I think we're facing this sort of double-edged sword where your explanation for the pre-transition mental health issues is that they're being forced to live in a body that their mind doesn't match with. But then post-transition, it's that they're just being bullied to death, and that's why they're still experiencing the same mental health issues. It just seems like there's always an explanation, and sometimes it's Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation is that mental health trauma and issues can lead to feeling incongruent with one's gender.
Well, mental health issues, without question, can have an impact on individuals. I think that's something we can agree on.
Sure.
But I do think all of this research is dangerous. I mean, if you think about it, if you are an individual that feels like you are the other, you feel like if you come forward, then you will be targeted, how likely are you to actually participate in these types of research and studies and analyses? So, I take it all with a grain of salt. And again, I do come to this from a place where I feel like there's good intent. I don't think that there's, quote unquote, witch hunt happening the way that some others might. But I think, again, it's just very, very complicated. And no matter what you ultimately think about it, these are issues that are going to continue to surface and that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I'm a little hung up on the research is dangerous point. Can you just expand on that a little bit more, on what you meant by that?
What I mean is that you have to really, really look beneath the surface of any analysis of anything.
Of course, yeah.
And to see who they're talking to, whether there's actually participation bias one way or another before you get to the findings.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's what I'm getting at, which is that the majority of studies that came out early on in this process of trying to understand how to treat gender dysphoria, particularly among young people, had a lot of problems with people dropping out of the study. So, for example, people who decided that they didn't want to continue treatment paths were no longer included in the final results. Some studies had as high as an 80% dropout rate. And then there's another large study that's often cited out of California where it's actually an opt-in study, and it uses a large database of people who basically filled out a survey about whether or not they went on puberty blockers or hormone therapy. And the study is fundamentally flawed because a lot of the people who said that they went on puberty blockers didn't actually transition until they were adults. Obviously, they wouldn't have been prescribed puberty blockers if they were over the age of 18 and had already gone through puberty. Whereas only over the past 3 to 4 years have there actually been double-blind, well-designed studies that have actually researched this issue. And these are the ones that have shown the opposite of what the transgender activists claim to be true.
Well, I think we're ultimately going to have to agree to disagree on this, and I continue to believe that we have a lot more digging and understanding still to come.
All right, sounds good. I agree. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising. We'll be back right after this.